There was a wooden plane holding open a chicken coop door in a garden outside Chesterfield this spring, grey with age, half rotten at one end, and the fella's wife had already put 2 more just like it out for the bin men. This one had a maker's mark stamped into the toe that most people would never think to look for. It sold for just over £900. £900 out of a doorstop, with the wheelie bin already at the curb. My name is Raymond. 50 years working car boots, house clearances and shed sales right across the Midlands and the North, and old tools are the thing I never walk past. Today we are counting down 10 rusty old tools sitting in sheds and garages right now. Tools that most families would happily give away or scrap for a few coppers, and I am going to show you exactly how to tell the ordinary ones from the ones carrying real money. Before we get going, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Yorkshire, Cornwall, Australia. Does not matter to me. I read every single one, and stay with me to number 6, because that is the tool that cost me more than anything else on this list, and I lost it over a £5 note. Let me be straight with you before we start counting. Most old tools you find in a shed are a £5 to £20 tool. Out of 100 pieces I go through at a house clearance, 80 are only fit for using, not collecting. 15 will land somewhere between £50 and £200, and a small handful climb past 1,000. Those are the 10 I am telling you about today. Rare is rare, but rare is also sitting under a workbench right now with cobwebs across it, and nobody has looked properly in 30 years. Here is why the old tools are different, and nobody ever explains this part properly. Pick up a modern plane or a modern chisel from a shop shelf, and the steel feels thin, the fit feels loose, everything is stamped out and machine ground in a factory in 5 minutes flat. Now pick up something made in Sheffield before the war. The steel is heavier for its size. The fit between the parts is tight, hand-fettled, no play in it anywhere. That is your first clue with anything metal. Second clue, look at the timber. Old tool handles are proper boxwood, beech or rosewood, dense and dark with age, not the pale soft ash you get on a modern handle from a DIY shed. Third, look for a maker's mark stamped or etched somewhere on the tool, usually near the top of a chisel blade, on the frog of a plane, or on the medallion set into a saw handle. That mark is everything, and we will come back to it again and again today. 2 quick rules for dating anything you find. If a tool says made in England, that generally means it predates the 1980s, when most of the big factories either closed or moved production abroad, so that phrase alone tells you something. And if you find a tool with no country of origin marked on it whatsoever, that is often a very good sign, because the law requiring a country of origin stamp only came in during the very late 1800s. No country mark at all can mean you are holding something genuinely old. One more thing before we start. A size or number stamped into a tool very rarely means what you think it means. It is usually a model number specific to that one maker, not a measurement, so do not assume anything until you have actually looked the mark up. Right. Let us start at number 10. Number 10. The unmarked boxwood and steel chisel set nobody bothers to look at twice. No name. No stamp visible at first glance, just a wooden roll of 6 or 8 chisels that somebody's granddad kept in the shed for 40 years. Everybody walks past these because they are hunting for a big name on the blade. But here is the thing. A huge amount of genuinely good Sheffield steel left the factories with no maker's name at all, sold under trade names to ironmongers who wanted the tools cheap and anonymous, or sold as what collectors call second-quality lines, where the steel and the fettling were exactly the same as the branded tools, just without the stamp that added to the price. The feature that gives away a genuine old unmarked Sheffield chisel is the bolster, that little collar between the blade and the handle. On the good ones it is neatly forged, tapered, and fitted snug into the boxwood with no gap. On a cheap modern reproduction, that bolster is often just pressed on and sits loose. At a church hall sale in Bakewell, they had a wicker basket of odds and ends under the table, £3 for the lot. Underneath a broken hand drill was a roll of 6 chisels, Boxwood handles gone almost black with age and linseed oil. 4 were nothing special. 2 had that tight hand-forged bolster and a blade profile you only see on pre-war steel. £70 for those 2, and it took me all of 10 minutes to spot them. Your checklist. 1. Feel for a tight forged bolster with no gap. 2. Look at the handle timber. Dark, dense boxwood rather than pale, modern wood. 3. Check the blade for a hollow ground back, a slight concave polish that only hand finishing produces. Names to watch for even on unmarked pieces, early Sheffield trade tools, and anything that later turns out to be an unmarked Marples second. Number 9 is the one almost every family already has hanging in the garage and has never once looked at properly. Number 9, the early record hand plane, before the cheaper post-war castings came in. Record tools out of Sheffield made planes from the 1930s right through to the 1980s, and because they kept making them for so long, and because so many survived, people assume every single record plane is just an ordinary DIY tool worth a $5 at a car boot. Most of them are. But the early castings, particularly anything made before the war or in the first years just after it, used a different casting process and a different frog design that later cheaper production quietly dropped. The feature that dates an early record is the depth adjuster knob and the shape of the lever cap. On the early ones, the lever cap has a kidney-shaped cutout, and the casting around the mouth of the plane is thinner and crisper, with much less flash left over from the mold. Later planes get thicker, blunter castings because the factory sped up the process to cut costs. Second, check underneath for the model number cast into the sole. A number 4 or a number 5 is common, but the very early number 04.5 and the number 02, the tiny, smoothing planes, are the ones worth chasing, because they made far fewer of them. At a farm dispersal sale near Melton Mowbray, a whole tea chest of tools went across as one lot, no reserve. £8 for the chest. Buried under a broken spade handle was an early number 02 record, kidney-shaped lever cap, tight mouth, barely a mark of rust on the sole because it had been kept oiled and wrapped in newspaper. That one made £135. £8 into 135 is the kind of day that keeps you going back to farm sales. Your checklist. 1. Kidney-shaped lever cap rather than a plain rounded one. 2. Crisp thin casting with no heavy flash lines. 3. Check the sole for the model number, and remember the very small and very large sizes are worth more than the common number 4. Number 8 gets thrown in a skip more often than anything else on this list, because people think a rusty saw is just scrap. Number 8, the Spear and Jackson hand saw with the etched medallion still legible. Spear and Jackson have been making edge tools and saws in Sheffield since the 1760s, and for most of that time they put a proper etched maker's mark right onto the blade itself, not just stamped into the handle medallion. That etching is your whole ball game with an old saw. On a genuine older blade, the etching is fine, detailed, almost like an engraving, showing the full company name and often a little crest or crown above it. On later, cheaper blades, that etching gets simplified down to just a stamped name with none of the detail. Second thing to check, the handle. The very good older saws have an applewood handle, sometimes with a carved lamb's tongue where your thumb rests, and brass split nuts holding the handle to the blade rather than steel screws. Brass split nuts nearly always mean an older, better-made saw. At a house clearance in a mining village outside Barnsley, a whole rack of saws had been left hanging in the coal shed for what looked like decades, black with soot and grime. The family just wanted the shed cleared, take the lot for a tenner. Under all that grime, one saw had brass split nuts, and once I got a rag and a bit of white spirit onto the blade near the heel, that fine, detailed etching came up clear as day. £110 for that single saw, and I gave the rest away to a lad doing up his first workshop. Your checklist. 1. Look for fine, detailed etching on the blade itself, not just a stamped handle medallion. 2. Brass split nuts rather than plain steel screws. 3. An applewood or beech handle with a proper carved thumb rest, not a plain flat handle. Number 7 is where the money really starts to step up, and it is a name most people have heard of, but do not know how to date. Number 7. Marples chisels and gouges carrying the Shamrock trademark. William Marples and Sons out of Sheffield ran from the 1820s right through the 20th century, and their Shamrock brand, marked with a little three-leaf clover pressed into the steel, is one of the most collected marks in British hand tools. What separates the good ones from the ordinary later production is the bolster shape again, but this time paired with the handle material. The earlier Shamrock chisels have octagonal boxwood handles with a brass ferrule at the top, hand-turned rather than moulded, and you can often feel a very slight variation from one chisel to the next in a set, because they were finished by hand rather than pressed out identically on a machine. One warning here, because it catches people out constantly. Marples continued making tools right up until relatively recently under various owners, and later production still carries a Shamrock stamp, but on a much thinner, lighter blade with a plastic or cheap wood handle. That later stuff is a working tool, not a collector's piece. My cousin out past Ripley let me go through his late father's workshop before it got cleared, in exchange for hauling the scrap metal to the yard for him. On a shelf above the vise, wrapped in an old jumper, was a set of 8 bevel-edge Marples chisels, octagonal boxwood handles, brass ferrules, that crisp early Shamrock stamp on every blade. £190 for the set. Understand the range, though. A single common Marples chisel in nice condition is a £15 to £30 tool. It is the complete matching sets, and the larger sizes like the 1.5-inch and 2-inch bevel-edge chisels that push the value properly upward. Your checklist. 1. Octagonal boxwood handle with a brass ferrule, hand-turned rather than machine identical. 2. The Shamrock stamp on a substantial heavier blade rather than a thin modern one. 3. A full matching set is worth chasing far harder than a single chisel. Now number 6, and I am still annoyed with myself about this one. Number 6. The early Stanley plane made in England at the Sheffield works before production, quietly shifted and changed. Stanley is an American company, everybody knows that, but for decades they ran a full factory in Sheffield producing planes specifically for the British and export markets. And those Sheffield-made Stanleys, particularly from before the 1950s, are cast differently to anything made later at any factory. The tell is the frog, that angled part inside the plane the blade sits against. On the earlier Sheffield castings, the frog has a fully machined flat contact surface with crisp square edges. From around the 1960s onward, Stanley moved to a ribbed frog design to save on machining time. And that ribbed pattern is instantly obvious once you know to look for it. A fully flat, fully machined frog on a plane, stamped Made in England, is your green light. There was a flea market at a rugby club up in Barnsley, trestle tables set out in the car park on a Sunday morning. A stallholder had a box of what he called garage clear-out planes. £15 each, no negotiating, he said. Take it or leave it. One of them had that flat machined frog, crisp casting, an early kidney-shaped lever cap, same as we talked about with the record plane. I did the sums in my head, decided £15 felt steep for what I thought it was, put it back down, and told myself I would think about it over a cup of tea from the van. I came back inside 20 minutes, and it was gone. Another picker I have known for years had bought it not 5 minutes after I walked off, and he told me later, grinning the whole time, that it cleaned up and sold for £210. £15 I would not spend cost me nearly £200, and that is the most expensive cup of tea I have ever had. So learn from me on this one. Your checklist. 1. A fully flat machined frog with no ribbing. 2. Made in England stamped on the iron or the sole. 3. Kidney-shaped lever cap, rather than the later plain rounded style. And if you are getting something useful out of this video, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because I put a new one out every week straight from real sheds and real house clearances, and I would rather you catch the one that matches exactly what is sitting in your own garage. Number 5. The Mathieson brace with brass fittings and a rosewood head. Alexander Mathieson and Son operated out of Glasgow from the 1830s, and they made some of the finest hand braces ever produced in Britain. the kind of tool a carpenter would have owned for his entire working life, and then passed down. What makes a Mathieson brace stand out from an ordinary carpenter's brace is the combination of a rosewood head and handle, deep reddish-brown and dense to the touch, paired with brass fittings around the chuck, rather than plain steel. The chuck mechanism itself on a genuine Mathieson has a smoothness to the action that cheaper braces never quite achieve, because the internal jaws were hand-fitted rather than simply stamped out. Second thing to check, the head of the brace, the part your palm rests against while turning it, should spin freely and smoothly with almost no play from side to side, a sign of proper bearing work inside. At a cottage clearance out near Matlock, an elderly gentleman's workshop was being emptied by his daughter, who told me quite plainly she just wanted it gone before the house went on the market. A wooden tool chest in the corner had layers of tools stacked inside, and right at the bottom, wrapped in an oily cloth, was a rosewood-headed brace with brass fittings. The chuck action smooth as anything I had felt in years. £95 for that one piece alone, and the daughter was simply glad to have the chest emptied. Your checklist. 1. Rosewood head and handle, dense and dark rather than pale beech. 2. Brass fittings around the chuck rather than plain steel. 3. A smooth, tight spinning action in the head with no side-to-side play. Number 4 is the one people finally start to recognize once you point out what to look for. Number 4, Edward Preston Sons ironwork, particularly their smaller specialist planes and spoke shaves. Preston operated out of Birmingham from the mid-1800s and became known for beautifully finished small tools, rebate planes, plough planes, and shaves with a level of nickel plating and finishing that most other makers simply did not bother with. A Preston tool in decent condition has a quality of finish you can spot from across a stall, a bright, even nickel plate on the metal parts, rather than the duller, patchier plating you see on cheaper competitors. The company mark itself is usually stamped clearly into the metal body, often alongside a registration or patent number, which is worth looking up because Preston registered a great many individual tool designs, and some are considerably rarer than others. What makes Preston tools genuinely useful to know about is that they are common enough you will actually come across them, unlike some of the rarer names on this list, but scarce enough in good condition that a nicely preserved example still commands serious money. A number 8. Preston shave in good order with most of its original plating is comfortably in the £50 to £150 range, and the rarer, more specialized plain designs go well beyond that. I found mine folded into a drawer of mixed hardware at an antiques fair in Newark, sitting among modern spanners and rusted padlocks that nobody had bothered sorting properly. A Preston rebate plain, plating still largely intact, clear maker's mark. That one I kept for myself. It lives on my own bench now and gets used most weekends. Not everything has to be flipped straight back out. Your checklist. 1. Bright, even nickel plating on the metal body rather than dull or flaking plate. 2. A clear stamped maker's mark alongside a patent or registration number. 3. Check that all the original screws and adjusters are present, because a Preston missing its fittings loses value fast. Number 3 is a name that carries weight the moment a serious tool collector spots it, and it is worth knowing even if you never plan to sell a thing. Number 3. Sorby and other genuine Sheffield edge tool makers, producing large carving gouges and turning chisels rather than ordinary bench chisels. Sorby has been operating in Sheffield since the 1700s, one of the true old names in British edge tools, and while their standard bench chisels turn up reasonably often, their larger wood-turning and carving gouges are a different matter entirely, made in smaller numbers for a specialist trade, and far less likely to survive in usable condition. The lettering is the key here, exactly as with the earlier makers we have talked about, but on Sorby pieces you are looking for a full stamped name across the blade, with a distinct typeface that changed subtly across different eras of production, so an older stamp reads slightly differently to a mid-century one. Odd or oversized profiles push the value further, because most working tradesmen bought the standard sizes and the unusual gouge profiles nobody particularly wanted at the time are the ones that survive in the smallest numbers today. In a joiner's workshop being cleared near Chesterfield, stacked in a drawer that had clearly not been opened in years, I found a set of large carving gouges, the Sorby stamp still crisp despite a thick coating of surface rust across every blade. £260 for that drawer, rust and all, and I never touched a wire brush to a single one of them before selling. Understand the honest range here, though. A common Sorby bench chisel in nice shape is generally a £20 to £50 tool. It is the larger carving gouges, the specialist turning tools, and the unusual profiles that push properly into the hundreds. Your checklist. 1. Full stamped lettering across the blade rather than an abbreviated mark. 2. Check for unusual or oversized gouge profiles rather than standard bench chisel shapes. 3. Do not clean the rust off before you have identified exactly what you are holding. Number 2 is older than everything we have talked about so far, and it needs a completely different eye. Number 2, hand-forged blacksmith-made tools from before the mass production era, roughly before 1850. Flip a tool over, or run your thumb along the metal where a factory-made piece would show a perfectly even, symmetrical surface, and look instead for slight irregularities, small hammer marks, a faint texture that machine grinding never leaves behind. That is the signature of hand forging, and it means the tool was made individually by a smith rather than stamped out identically alongside 1,000 others in a factory. Most of these carry no maker's name whatsoever, because a great many came from small local forges that never marked their work at all, which is exactly why so many end up scrapped or sold for next to nothing. Nobody recognizes what they are looking at. A hand-forged tool in good, honest condition can be worth anywhere from £30 or £40 for a common item, right up into the hundreds for something unusual or particularly well-preserved. An early hand-forged adze or a wrought iron marking gauge with genuine age to it. At a farmhouse clearance out near Wirksworth, an old timber toolbox sat under a workbench that clearly had not been moved in a generation, thick with dust and cobwebs. Inside, among a jumble of more ordinary Victorian tools, was a small hand-forged plain iron with unmistakable hammer texture along its length, and a faint file mark where a maker's stamp should have been but had long since worn away. £70 for that single blade. Your checklist. 1. Feel for slight hammer texture rather than a perfectly even factory finish. 2. Expect little or no maker's mark, and do not dismiss a piece just because it is unbranded. 3. Listen for a proper ring rather than a dull thud when you tap the metal, because that tells you the temper and structure of the steel is still sound. Now, number 1, a genuine Norris dovetailed infill smoothing plane. Before we get into it, understand that this sits on a completely different level to everything else on this list. Norris operated in London from the late 1800s into the mid-1900s, and they made what most serious collectors consider the finest hand planes ever produced in Britain, an infill plane, meaning the wooden body is dovetailed directly into a steel or bronze shell, rather than the timber simply sitting inside a cast iron housing. The dovetails themselves, visible along the sides of the plane where the steel meets the infill, are cut by hand, tight and precise, and that dovetail joint is the single most important thing to check, because a genuine Norris shows crisp, close-fitting dovetails with no gap and no filler, while reproductions and lesser makers almost always show slightly looser, less precise joinery once you know what you are looking for. Almost nobody buying at a general house clearance recognizes what a Norris infill plane is. Collectors count surviving examples of the rarer models by the dozen rather than the thousand, and genuine pieces in good condition have sold for anywhere from £2,000 to £5,000, with the rarest and best preserved examples going considerably higher still at specialist auction. That is not a typical price for anything in this list. That is the very top of the mountain. I have held exactly one at a preview table before a specialist tool auction out near Sheffield some years back. Rosewood infill dark with age, dovetails so tight you could barely see the joint line at all. The bidding on that plane was over inside 2 minutes, and it went to a phone bidder for a figure that made the whole room go quiet. I have checked the sides of every plane I have picked up since, purely out of habit. Your checklist. 1. Tight, crisp, dovetail joints with no visible gap or filler where the steel meets the infill. 2. Dense timber infill, rosewood or ebony, rather than a lighter modern wood. 3. If you think you genuinely have one, do not clean it, do not oil it, and do not sell it at a car boot sale. Take it to somebody who knows infill planes specifically, because this is one category where a specialist valuation genuinely matters. Now, some honesty about condition, because this applies to everything we have talked about today. A crack in a blade or a casting kills the value stone dead. It does not simply reduce it, it kills it. Even a hairline crack turns a 500-pound tool into scrap metal. So before you get excited about anything, tap it gently and listen. A sound piece of steel rings. A cracked one gives a dull thud. Next, check for warping. Lay a plain sole flat on a table and see if it rocks, because a bowed sole is a serious fault that no genuine collector will look past. Pitting hurts value too, deep pitting especially, where rust has eaten right into the surface of the steel rather than just sitting on top of it. Surface rust hurts less than most people assume, and old dirt or dried oil costs you nothing at all. So do not panic the moment something looks grubby. And here is the big one, the one I need you to really take on board. Do not take a wire wheel or an angle grinder to an old tool before you know what you are holding. I watched a fella at a car boot sale take a wire brush to a chisel blade right there on his stall, trying to make it look more presentable to sell, and in about 90 seconds he had ground away the very stamp that would have told him, and any buyer, exactly what he was holding and what it was worth. Grinding erases the very detail that gives these tools their value, and any collector spots it from across the room. Identify first, then decide whether and how to clean. Never the other way around. Here is what genuinely gets me about all this. Nobody ever teaches anybody these marks. There is no class down at the community centre, no leaflet through the letterbox, nothing at all. So a family clears out a father's or a grandfather's workshop, and the whole lot goes straight to the scrap metal yard, or the skip outside, and the man at the weighbridge knows exactly what he is buying by weight alone. The dealers know. The pickers know. They are counting on you not knowing. And that is not some conspiracy. It is simply an information gap. And this video is here to close a little bit of it. 10 tools down, and it comes back to the same thing every single time. Value hides in plain sight, not behind glass in a museum somewhere, but in the shed door, in the toolbox under the bench, in the drawer nobody has opened since somebody passed away and the family just wanted the place cleared. So tonight, or this weekend, go and check the shed, check the garage, check that toolbox pushed under the stairs that nobody has looked in for years. Turn every tool over. Look for the tight dovetail, the crisp stamp, the flat machined frog, the brass split nuts, and read the maker's mark properly before you decide anything is just scrap. Then come and tell me in the comments what you found. I answer every single one, and your find might be exactly the one I open with next week. Next week we are going after old fishing reels, because there are reels sitting in tackle boxes right now worth considerably more than the rod they were ever attached to. I will see you then.